Hi, I'm Daniel Burstein, the Director of Editorial Content for MECLABS. We're here in Orlando, Florida at B2B Summit 2012. And I have our keynote speaker with us, Sally Hogshead, the Chief Fascination Officer of Fascinate Incorporated. Sally just delivered this really rousing keynote with a lot of information into her research into 49 personality archetypes. And I think you surveyed 100,000 or 10,000?
Yeah, now we're up to 120,000 people.
120,000 people,
Yeah.
okay. Well, what was really interesting to me from what you talked about is for B2B marketers, we face this challenge all the time, right? We have to talk to different types of people, right? And that's how we segment our content to deliver relevant content. For example, if you're an IT company, you got to probably speak at that lower level to tech people who are interested in feeds and speeds, and the business leaders who are interested in growing their business. So how can you use your research to help deliver relevant content to audiences like that?
What we've learned from our research is there's a traditional way of thinking about how we segment the audience. And the problem is that as marketers, if I'm segmenting my audience in the same way that you are and we're competitors, then we're probably going to develop very similar messages. As we've researched 120,000 people, we've learned that there are specific hardwired patterns that people have in how they receive messages, how they perceive information. And then if you can identify what those patterns are, you can create messages that very effectively speak exactly to them and earn attention in a distracted environment. So it makes your message more effective and more competitive. So for example, there are 7 primary triggers that I talked about today in the keynote and in my writing. One of the triggers is the trust trigger. People who use the trust trigger, this type of an audience or customer, they're going to want to know that there's consistency and reliability in everything. They're going to want to know that something's going to remain the same over time. So when you sell to them, it's very important that you create a long-term vision for the future and that you hearken to the past. On the other hand, if you're talking to somebody who values prestige, which is all about having higher standards, that person is going to want to make sure that your product or service is going to be able to exceed what they could get from anybody else. So in this case, you want to talk about awards, you want to talk about results, you want to talk about the ways in which you have better education, better findings, you're more refined in the way in which you deliver the product or service. And by doing this, we can find ways that not thinking about customers in terms of how they're buying the product, but in terms of how they receive the message. And as marketers, this is really what's at the key of understanding the Fascinate system. How are people going to receive your message so that you're not just putting more clutter out there, you're actually putting out content that's relevant and needed and desirable.
So how they receive your message, that ties perfectly into content marketing. What are some, to use your word, triggers that marketers can look for as they decide what types of triggers to use?
Well, one example would be make sure that you create a strong and immediate emotional reaction. If somebody has a strong response to a marketing message that you have, they're far less likely to ignore it or forget it. The problem is that as marketers, we're playing not to lose. So we put messages out there that don't offend anybody. And so nobody really responds. We're throwing money out there. If you create an emotional response within your audience, when the human brain is emotionally engaged in a message, that it can't forget the message while it's emotionally engaged. So the goal is to try to find ways that we can be selectively provocative. And here's what I mean by selectively provocative. If you know that your target audience has certain preferences, then play up to that by making sure that you're only talking to those specific preferences, by getting on that channel or that bandwidth. We call it resonance. There's something that you offer that they need, and it's at that intersection that you create the opportunity of the sale.
Speaking of opportunities for sale and how you resonate, another thing you mentioned in your keynote, which I thought was really interesting, was that you don't go to Kinko's to print your business cards. You don't need to meet 10,000 people. You just need to meet the right people.
The right people, yes.
And so you have these business cards, $2 a piece, and you estimate you've generated $500,000 in revenue for it. So as you talk about how you market yourself, a lot of our audience is engaged in field marketing, event marketing. So as you make that in-person connection, what's your advice for doing that?
This is a great lesson that I learned when I was a creative director on the Mini Cooper launch here in the United States. And one of the tenets that Crispin Porter-Bogusky had in the Mini Cooper launch was, we don't need to talk to a lot of people, we need to talk to the right people, and we need to make sure that those people talk to other people and that they physically take the ad and that they show the ad to other people, and that's how we're going to get the reach. Because otherwise, the $12 or $15 million launch budget couldn't possibly compete with VW's Bug launch of $80 million the same year. So in the same way, when I created a business card, I decided that I was going to create the world's most fascinating business card, $2 a piece, because I didn't want to put out a bunch of business cards. I wanted to put out a few business cards talking to the right people. And actually, I have one right here.
Oh, perfect. We all wanted to get one, so.
I know, totally. So this is what the business cards look like. It says, at the top it says, how do you fascinate? And then there are these different options. Now, I happen to know, Daniel, that the way in which you fascinate is that you arouse curiosity. Curiosity means that you selectively edit information strategically. So you use mystique, and you use rebellion, which means you change the game. So the rebellion trigger combined with the mystique trigger, this personality archetype, is named the secret weapon. So imagine, it means that you're great at being able to solve problems in a way that's going to be strategic, understated, and irreverent. You're going to be able to come in creatively and find solutions that other people couldn't. Now imagine that you and I were meeting each other, and I said to you, it's no surprise that mystique was your primary trigger, because you have a very subtle way of delivering information. You're rational in the way in which you approach it, but you also use creativity. So if I said, I think that what makes you fascinating is that you use the mystique trigger, and I gave that to you, after our conversation, you're going to be far more likely to remember my brand than if I took out my Kinko's 0.02 cents per business card and remember it. So here's the lesson. The lesson is not about business cards. The lesson is, don't think in terms of quantity, think in terms of creating an engagement with every single interaction. And this becomes even more important if you don't have a huge budget. If you have a huge budget, you can afford to just pound a message in over and over again with reach and frequency. But if you don't have a huge budget, you have to make every single engagement count.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Sally. And for our audience, you can find out much more marketing case studies at marketingsherpa.com. And where can they learn about your research?
Howtofascinate.com. We have tons of research available online.